In a city built on greed, glamour, and gambling, one man stood as the shadow behind the glittering lights of Las Vegas. His name was Tony Spilotro, feared by many, trusted by none, and remembered as the Ant, the man who brought Chicago's darkness to the desert. Chicago in the 1940s was a city built on hustle, a mix of hard-working immigrants, smoky bars, and the ever-present shadow of organized crime. It was a place where opportunity and danger shared the same street corner, and young Tony Spilotro was born right in the middle of it. Born on May 19, 1938, to Italian immigrant parents, Tony grew up on the city's tough West Side, an area where the law of the street often outweighed the law of the state. His family ran a small restaurant, Patsy's, known for good food and quietly for being a hangout spot for mobsters. The men who came and went from that restaurant weren't just customers. They were power brokers of Chicago's underworld. Tony grew up watching them, the sharp suits, the whispered conversations, the unspoken authority they carried. He saw how fear and respect could coexist in one glance, how a soft voice could command more than a police badge ever could. From the start, Tony wasn't interested in ordinary success. He wasn't built for a quiet life behind a counter or a 9-to-5 job. He was street smart, quick to fight, and even quicker to adapt. Teachers at his school often described him as disruptive, defiant, and unpredictable. But on the streets, those same traits became tools for survival. By the time he was a teenager, he had already dropped out of high school and found himself orbiting the small-time gangs that operated in his neighborhood. Gangs that acted as feeders for the larger criminal organizations that controlled Chicago. Tony's family was no stranger to the mob world. His older brothers, particularly Vincent, had already made connections within the Chicago outfit, the powerful crime syndicate that traced its lineage back to Al Capone. To Tony, these weren't criminals, they were role models. They were men who controlled their own destinies in a city where most people lived and died without ever being noticed. By his late teens, Tony was running errands for local mob figures, delivering envelopes, watching doors, making collections when debts weren't paid on time. Each small job taught him something about how the outfit worked. He learned that in this world, reputation was everything. You didn't have to be the biggest man in the room, you just had to be the one willing to go further than anyone else. And Tony did. His temper became legendary in the neighborhoods of Chicago. He was short, standing just about 5 feet 5 inches, but what he lacked in size he made up for in ferocity. He earned the nickname the Ant, a reference not just to his stature but to his relentlessness. An ant could carry many times its own weight, and Tony carried the weight of violence with ease. The name started as a joke among older mobsters, but it stuck. In time it became a warning. By the 1950s, Spilotro had caught the attention of the outfit's leadership. He was loyal, vicious when necessary, and absolutely unflinching. When the mob needed someone to collect debts, intimidate witnesses, or send a message, Tony was the man they called. He had no hesitation about doing the dirty work others avoided, beatings, threats, even killings. His first known murder was in 1962, when William McCarthy and James Miraglia were found dead in a car trunk, victims of a brutal execution. Rumor had it that Tony had personally tortured McCarthy, placing his head in a vice and tightening it until his skull cracked. The message was unmistakable: betrayal to the outfit came with a price. In a world where most men feared getting blood on their hands, Tony Spilotro built his reputation from it. He was young, ambitious, and ruthless, the kind of man the outfit needed to maintain control during an era when law enforcement was starting to close in on the old mob families. But beneath his violence was calculation. Tony wasn't reckless in his early years, he was strategic. He understood that power in the mob wasn't just about muscle, it was about fear, relationships, and information. He made himself indispensable to higher-ups by keeping order among the lower ranks. If a bookie went missing, Tony found him. If a debt went unpaid, Tony made sure it was settled. His loyalty to the Chicago outfit earned him both respect and protection. Older mobsters like Joseph "Joey" the Clown Lombardo and Tony Accardo saw in him a useful weapon, someone who could enforce their will in the streets while keeping their own hands clean. Spilotro became part of a new generation of enforcers, one that blended the old-world mafia code with a new kind of American criminal ambition. At the same time, Chicago was changing. Federal investigations were mounting, corruption was becoming harder to hide, and the old mob structure was starting to fracture under the pressure. The outfit needed new territory, a place to keep their money flowing and their influence alive. That opportunity came in the form of Las Vegas, a city rising from the desert, where casinos could wash millions of dollars in illegal profits under the bright glow of neon lights. And Tony Spilotro, the street enforcer from Chicago, was about to be given the biggest promotion of his life. He wasn't a businessman. He wasn't a gambler. He was muscle, pure, disciplined, and deadly. The outfit didn't send him to Las Vegas to make friends or to manage ledgers. They sent him there to protect their investment, to make sure the casino skim, the secret cash flow taken off the top before taxes, kept going back to Chicago without interruption. From a kid running errands in his family's restaurant to a feared enforcer trusted with millions in mob profits, Tony Spilotro's rise was as brutal as it was inevitable. In a world built on loyalty, violence, and greed, he had proven himself indispensable. Chicago had made him, and soon Las Vegas would reveal what he had truly become. By the early 1970s, Las Vegas had become more than just a desert playground. Beneath the glitz of neon signs and the charm of roulette wheels, the city was the mob's greatest invention, a golden machine designed to clean dirty money. Millions of dollars flowed through the casinos every day, and the Chicago outfit wanted its share. But managing this skim, the unrecorded cash secretly taken from casino profits, required more than accountants. It needed someone who could enforce discipline, keep people in line, and silence any threat that might jeopardize the flow of money. That's where Tony Spilotro came in. He had proven his loyalty in Chicago, earning a reputation as a man who didn't ask questions and never hesitated to act. So when the bosses back home needed someone to protect their financial interests in Las Vegas, Spilotro was chosen. His mission was simple: make sure the money keeps moving and no one talks. The man he was assigned to protect was Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal, a brilliant but volatile casino operator who ran the Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, and the Marina for the outfit. Rosenthal handled the numbers, but Spilotro handled the people. It was a perfect balance, brains and muscle working under the desert sun. When Tony arrived in Las Vegas, he was stepping into a city built on illusion, a place where everyone smiled but no one was truly clean. He quickly realized that Las Vegas wasn't just a gambling paradise, it was a kingdom of control. The mob controlled the dealers, the pit bosses, the security, even the politicians who looked the other way. Tony's job was to make sure it stayed that way. At first he kept a low profile. He opened a small jewelry store called the Gold Rush in the Circus shopping plaza. To the public it was just another flashy Vegas shop. But to those who knew the truth, the Gold Rush was Spilotro's front, a meeting point, a fence for stolen goods, and the unofficial headquarters for his growing crew. Behind its polished counters and glittering watches, Tony's men planned burglaries, robberies, and intimidation jobs. He brought with him a group of trusted criminals from Chicago, men who understood his code and didn't flinch under pressure. They soon became known as the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, named after their unique method of breaking into homes and businesses by literally punching holes through walls. These weren't just petty thieves. They were specialists, skilled burglars, safecrackers, and enforcers who operated with precision. But even as he expanded his side operations, Spilotro's main focus remained the casinos. The outfit skim from Las Vegas was worth millions, and Tony's job was to protect that pipeline. He intimidated casino employees, watched for cheaters, and handled anyone who threatened to talk to law enforcement. His presence alone kept most people in line. The dealers whispered his name with fear, and those who owed money often paid before he even had to ask. Yet, there was something different about Las Vegas compared to Chicago. In Chicago, the mob's power was hidden in the shadows. In Las Vegas, the lines between crime and business blurred under the bright lights. Tony liked that. He enjoyed the glamour, the attention, the sense of being untouchable. For the first time, he wasn't just an enforcer, he was a figure of power. People recognized him at casinos, at nightclubs, at restaurants. He dressed sharp, drove expensive cars, and dined with celebrities. But power in Las Vegas came with temptation. The more visible Tony became, the more reckless he grew. His jewelry store became a hub for stolen goods, his crew began hitting high-end homes, and soon his side operations started drawing unwanted attention from the FBI and local police. Tony didn't seem to care. He believed fear could silence anything: witnesses, investigators, even journalists. Still, Spilotro's rise in Las Vegas wasn't just about violence. He understood people. He could switch from charm to intimidation in seconds. When he wanted someone on his side, he bought them dinner, poured them a drink, made them feel important. When persuasion failed, he reminded them, subtly or directly, what happened to those who crossed him. Underneath that polished surface, Tony ruled with terror. There were stories, whispered among dealers and pit bosses, about what he did to informants. One of the most infamous tales involved a man who stole from the mob's casino profits. Spilotro allegedly tied him to a chair, placed his head in a vice, and tightened it until blood poured from his nose. Whether every story was true or not, it didn't matter. The fear was real and fear kept people silent. Tony also became deeply entangled in the personal lives of those around him. He started an affair with Jerry McGee, the glamorous wife of Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal, the very man he was supposed to protect. To outsiders it looked like passion, to the mob it looked like betrayal. The relationship blurred lines of loyalty and began to create cracks in the once stable alliance between Rosenthal, Spilotro, and their Chicago bosses. The FBI began watching closely. Wiretaps, surveillance, and informants painted a picture of a man who was losing control. Tony's reputation, once an asset, was now a liability. The more violent and unpredictable he became, the more attention he attracted. In a city where subtlety was survival, Spilotro had become too loud, too bold, too visible. But for a time, a brief, glittering moment, Tony Spilotro ruled Las Vegas from the shadows. He wasn't a casino owner or a public figure, but his influence reached every corner of the city. Dealers, gamblers, and mobsters alike knew his name. His glare could silence a room. His reputation alone could make millionaires tremble. Las Vegas had always been a city of illusions, but Tony Spilotro turned illusion into power. Behind the smiles and the champagne, behind every jackpot and neon sign, his shadow lingered. The Chicago mob had sent him to protect their money, but Tony, hungry for more than orders, began building a kingdom of his own. And with every dollar of blood-soaked profit that passed through his hands, he was drifting further away from loyalty and closer to destruction. By the mid-1970s, Las Vegas was Tony Spilotro's playground and his battlefield. He had arrived as the Chicago outfit's enforcer, but by now he had become something far more dangerous. A man who believed he was Las Vegas. Under his command, a shadow empire grew beneath the glow of the Strip. Every casino, every dealer, every hustler knew his name, and most knew better than to say it out loud. To understand Tony's reign, you have to understand his code. For him, fear was not just a weapon, it was a language. He spoke it fluently. He believed that respect meant nothing unless it was backed by terror. The casinos might have been run by executives in suits, but in the alleys behind them, Tony's word was law. He ruled with precision and paranoia. He trusted few, tested everyone, and punished betrayal without hesitation. Even a whisper of disloyalty could mean a death sentence. The line between business and bloodshed was razor thin, and Tony walked it every day with complete confidence. His crew, the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, became infamous. They were a collection of burglars, hitmen, and street criminals who operated under his direction. Their name came from their signature break-in method, smashing holes through walls instead of doors to avoid alarms. It was crude, noisy, and effective, much like their boss. But burglary was only a fraction of what they did. When the mob needed to send a message, Tony's men did it with brutality that stunned even other gangsters. He had an almost theatrical sense of violence. Every act was meant to teach a lesson, to remind people that the mob's reach was endless and mercy was a myth. One of the most haunting stories linked to Spilotro involved the torture of enemies and informants. In Chicago and Vegas alike, Tony was rumored to use a vice on his victims, tightening it slowly around their heads until blood streamed from their eyes and ears. Whether these stories were embellished or not, the psychological effect was devastating. People believed them, and that belief gave Tony absolute control. Fear kept the money flowing. Fear kept mouths shut. Fear kept Las Vegas in order, at least for a while. But absolute power has a way of unraveling even the sharpest minds. As his influence expanded, Spilotro's restraint began to erode. He no longer acted as a quiet guardian for Chicago's casino interests. He began to act like the city was his own fiefdom. He decided who lived, who earned, and who disappeared. His reputation for torture and violence grew so intense that even other mobsters began to keep their distance. Tony enjoyed the power, maybe too much. He liked being the man who could walk into a casino and have everyone go silent. He liked knowing that cops hesitated to approach him. He liked being the monster in everyone's story. But power, especially power rooted in fear, comes with a cost: isolation. Even his allies began to question him. Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal, the man he was originally sent to protect, became increasingly uncomfortable with Tony's methods. Lefty was a numbers man, a thinker, someone who believed in quiet control. Tony was chaos, loud, impulsive, and unpredictable. The more violent Tony became, the more attention he drew from law enforcement, and the more the FBI began to tighten its net around the mob's Vegas operations. The Hole-in-the-Wall Gang didn't help either. They were supposed to operate under Tony's control, but greed made them reckless. They started pulling jobs without permission, breaking the one rule that mattered most. Don't steal from the outfit. One botched burglary in particular, a 1981 heist at Bertha's Gifts and Home Furnishings, marked the beginning of the end. The gang was caught red-handed, and the arrests led to a flood of FBI testimony. Among those arrested was Frank Collada, Tony's closest associate, his friend and his right-hand man for years. Collada had shared meals, secrets, and crimes with Tony. But sitting in a prison cell, facing decades behind bars, he realized something terrifying. Tony might be planning to have him killed to keep him silent. The FBI even played Collada a tape where Tony could be heard saying something about cleaning our dirty laundry. Collada didn't need translation. He knew exactly what that meant. Instead of waiting to die, he flipped. Collada became a government witness, and Tony's greatest enemy. He testified before juries, revealing in chilling detail how Spilotro's operation worked. He described over 300 crimes, from robberies and extortion to multiple murders. He painted Tony as a sadistic figure, cold, calculating, and willing to kill anyone who stood in his way. While Spilotro's defense team, led by the future Las Vegas Mayor Oscar Goodman, managed to secure an acquittal in one major case, the damage was done. His aura of invincibility was cracking. The FBI now had names, dates, and evidence. Tony had spent years ruling through fear, but the walls were closing in, and this time no amount of intimidation could stop them. Still, Tony continued to project power. He acted calm in public, showing up at restaurants, talking to reporters, even smiling for photos. But beneath that surface, the tension was growing. The Chicago bosses were losing patience. His reckless behavior had jeopardized the mob's cash flow and brought heat to every level of the outfit structure. Even among killers, Tony had gone too far. What made Spilotro so terrifying was that his violence wasn't random, it was personal. He studied people before destroying them. He wanted his victims to know why they were dying, to understand that betrayal was never forgiven. He viewed loyalty like a religion, and breaking it was a sin punishable by pain. The result was a reign of terror that defined Las Vegas in the 1970s and early 80s. Behind every glimmering casino, there was the shadow of the ant, a man whose cruelty was whispered about more than any jackpot win or celebrity performance. Tony Spilotro had built his empire on blood, fear, and silence. But in the same way he demanded absolute control from everyone around him, he had lost control of himself. Violence, once his tool, had become his obsession. The monster that he'd created to keep others afraid was now consuming his own world. And in Las Vegas, a city built on illusion, even the most terrifying figures eventually find that the lights can turn against them. By the early 1980s, the empire Tony Spilotro had built in Las Vegas was beginning to rot from within. The same city that had once made him untouchable now seemed to be closing in on him from every direction. The law, the mob, and even his own friends. For years he had been the enforcer, the shadow figure who made fear a form of order. But fear, when stretched too far, breaks. And now, Tony was about to face the one thing he could never control: betrayal. The FBI had been watching him for years. They knew his cars, his habits, his jewelry shop, and the faces that came and went. Agents sat in unmarked vehicles across from the gold rush, recording who entered, who left, who carried bags that didn't look like they held diamonds. Surveillance teams followed him to dinners, to casinos, to meetings where money and threats were exchanged in the same breath. But what the FBI didn't need to see, they could hear. Wiretaps began to pick up Tony's conversations with his closest men. Most were coded, vague, almost poetic in their menace. But one tape changed everything. On it, Tony could be heard talking about cleaning our dirty laundry. It sounded harmless enough to anyone else, but to Frank Collada, his old friend and partner, it was a death sentence. Collada knew Tony's tone too well. He had watched him order hits with a half-smile, seen him turn from laughter to violence in a heartbeat. He understood that dirty laundry meant something, or someone, needed to be cleaned up permanently. Sitting in a prison cell after his arrest in 1982, Collada didn't need the FBI to explain what was coming. He already knew. The moment of truth came when the agents made their offer. They could protect him, or he could take his chances with Tony. For a man who had spent decades in the mob, turning on his boss was unthinkable. But Collada had seen too many men vanish to believe in loyalty anymore. In July 1982 he flipped. He signed an agreement with federal prosecutors, offering to tell them everything about Tony Spilotro, his crew, the burglaries, the murders, and the skim. It was the betrayal that would shatter Tony's world, because this wasn't just any associate. Collada was family. When word reached Tony that his right-hand man had turned informant, the walls of his Las Vegas kingdom began to crumble. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him. The invisible network of silence that had protected him for years was now full of holes. Every friend became a potential spy, every conversation a risk. The FBI wasted no time. They used Cullada's testimony to build a case that stretched across state lines: burglary, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and murder. In September 1983, Spilotro was indicted for conspiracy and obstruction of justice in the Sherwin Jerry Listener case, a murder tied to his Vegas operations. The charges carried the weight of years of investigations, hundreds of hours of recordings, and witnesses who had once been his own men. The trial in October 1983 was pure spectacle. Reporters packed the courtroom, curious to see the man who had inspired fear in two cities. Tony sat there in an immaculate suit, calm, collected, occasionally smiling, as if daring anyone to prove him guilty. Then came Cullada's testimony. He told the court that he had personally participated in over 300 crimes under Tony's command: robberies, burglaries, perjury, even 4 murders. He described in chilling detail how Spilotro had ordered hits, given coded commands, and used torture to make examples out of those who crossed him. He even told the jury how Tony had once ordered him to make a phone call that led 2 men, William McCarthy and James Miraglia, into a trap. Their bodies were later found in the trunk of a car, one with his head crushed in a vice, the other strangled. Every word painted Tony as a cold-blooded killer. And yet, somehow the man they called the Ant walked out of the courtroom free. Acquitted. The jury wasn't convinced beyond a reasonable doubt, and Spilotro's defense attorney, a fiery, sharp-witted lawyer named Oscar Goodman, who would one day become the mayor of Las Vegas, had done his job well. But acquittal didn't mean victory. Even though Tony beat the charges, the damage was irreversible. The outfit in Chicago was furious. His name was constantly in the papers. The FBI's spotlight had turned Las Vegas into a liability, and the bosses back home were losing millions as federal heat intensified. Tony's violent reputation, once useful, was now toxic. He had become too visible, too reckless, too uncontrollable. Inside the mob, visibility was death. The golden rule was simple: stay quiet, stay loyal, stay invisible. Tony had broken all 3. His affair with Jerry McGee, the wife of his supposed ally Frank Rosenthal, was the final insult. It wasn't just a betrayal of a friend, it was a direct sign of arrogance. Tony had begun to believe he was untouchable, that even the rules of the mob no longer applied to him. Rosenthal, once protected by Tony, now despised him. The FBI knew it. The mob bosses in Chicago knew it. And most importantly, Tony's enemies saw weakness. When a man like Spilotro starts making emotional decisions, when his anger and pride outweigh his discipline, the wolves begin to circle. By 1984, the FBI had dismantled most of the hole-in-the-wall gang. Many of Tony's old crew were either dead, imprisoned, or working with the government. His power in Las Vegas had shrunk to a shadow of what it once was. The man who once walked casino floors like a king now spent his days surrounded by suspicion and fear. But Tony wasn't ready to let go. He still believed he could rebuild, that one more big move could restore his empire. He underestimated how much the world around him had changed, how the bosses in Chicago had started to see him not as an asset, but as a liability. And in the mob, when the balance shifts from useful to dangerous, the ending is always the same. The cracks were now wide open. Betrayal, exposure, and mistrust had infected everything he built. The Chicago outfit had a decision to make. And Tony Spilotro, the once feared enforcer who brought the mob's muscle to Las Vegas, was about to find out what happens when fear no longer protects you. By 1986, Tony Spilotro's world had collapsed. The casinos that once funneled millions into Chicago's pockets were now under federal watch. His crew, the feared hole-in-the-wall gang, was dismantled, either sitting in cells or working with the FBI. His affair with Jerry McGee had destroyed his friendship with Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal. And his own bosses, the men who had once trusted him with their empire, now whispered his name only in anger. For years, Tony had been the Chicago outfit's sword in the desert. But in the mob, power is never truly owned, it's borrowed. And when you borrow too long, when your actions bring heat instead of money, the loan comes due. The call came from Chicago. It wasn't an official order, not at first, just a message delivered quietly through the network. Tony and his brother Michael were wanted back home. The bosses wanted to straighten things out. It sounded routine, a sit-down, a chance to clear the air. But deep down, Tony knew better. In the mob, there were no second chances. Michael, ever loyal, insisted on going with him. He wasn't part of Tony's violent life. He was more of a businessman, a man who ran restaurants and tried to keep clean. But family loyalty ran deep in the Spilotro bloodline. If Tony was walking into danger, Michael wasn't about to let him face it alone. The brothers left Las Vegas quietly. No entourage, no fanfare. Just two men heading east, unaware, or maybe fully aware, that they were driving straight into their own graves. Back in Chicago, the outfit had already decided their fate. The bosses had reached their limit. Spilotro's reckless behavior had put every operation at risk. His public profile was a flashing red light for law enforcement. The Rosenthal affair had turned trusted allies into enemies. Worst of all, his constant FBI attention had made it impossible to move money safely. Tony wasn't a soldier anymore, he was a liability. The decision was final, the ant had to go. On June 14, 1986, Tony and Michael Spilotro were lured to a suburban house in Bensonville, Illinois. To the brothers, it looked like a simple meeting, just a gathering of trusted men, a few drinks, maybe even a chance to fix old problems. Inside, waiting for them, were some of the outfit's most trusted enforcers. Accounts of what happened next vary, but one thing is certain. There was no negotiation. As soon as the Spilotro brothers entered the basement, they were surrounded. Tony, ever defiant, probably realized the truth the moment he saw the faces. Men who wouldn't meet his eyes, men he'd once called friends. The door closed and silence filled the room. There were no gunshots. No quick endings. The mob preferred it personal. They beat Tony and Michael to death, slowly, methodically, as was the old Chicago way. Fists, kicks, pipes. The brutality was absolute. It was said Tony tried to shield his brother, taking the blows meant for him. In those final moments, the man who had built an empire on fear was reduced to the same helplessness he had once inflicted on others. When it was over, the room was quiet again. Their bodies were stripped, bagged, and taken to an Indiana cornfield, a remote area near Enos, far from the bright lights of Las Vegas. There, the brothers were buried in a shallow grave, one on top of the other. No gravestones, no ceremony, just dirt and silence. For a week they were missing. Rumors spread quickly. Some said Tony had gone into hiding, others claimed he'd fled the country. But on June 22, 1986, the truth surfaced. A farmer spotted freshly turned soil in his field. Police arrived, dug into the ground, and found two decomposing bodies bound in plastic. Dental records confirmed what everyone already suspected. Tony and Michael Spilotro were dead. The news hit the criminal underworld like an earthquake. In Las Vegas, people whispered about it in hushed tones. Some were relieved, the reign of fear was finally over. Others couldn't believe that the ant, the man who once terrified entire casinos, had met such a brutal, human end. In Chicago, the message was clear. No one, not even the most feared enforcer, was bigger than the outfit. The killing restored the balance. A reminder to every soldier and capo that power, without obedience, leads to the same grave. The FBI called it one of the most significant mob murders of the decade. They suspected high-ranking Chicago mobsters, including Joseph "Joey the Clown" Lombardo and others, of ordering and carrying out the hit. But like many things in the world of organized crime, no one was ever definitively convicted for the Spilotro murders. Justice in that sense stayed buried with them. Meanwhile, Frank Rosenthal, the man Tony had once been sent to protect, survived several attempts on his own life, including a 1982 car bombing he narrowly escaped. When he heard about Tony's death, he reportedly said little. Maybe it was satisfaction, maybe it was disbelief. The two men had once been inseparable, partners, allies, even friends. But in the end, they had become symbols of what Las Vegas did to men like them. It magnified their power, then consumed them completely. Hollywood would later immortalize Tony Spilotro's story through the character Nicky Santoro in Martin Scorsese's 1995 film Casino, portrayed by Joe Pesci. The movie captured the chaos, the violence, and the paranoia of those final years, a cinematic mirror of a man who couldn't stop himself from pushing too far. But behind the fiction was the truth, a truth buried in an Indiana field. Tony Spilotro's rise had been fueled by loyalty, ambition, and fear. His fall was fueled by the same. In the end, the enforcer who ruled Las Vegas through violence met a death that mirrored his own methods, brutal, merciless, and absolute. The mob didn't just kill Tony Spilotro. They erased him. No monument, no farewell, no trace. Just two bodies in the dirt, a final message from an organization that never forgave failure or arrogance. And as the sun set over the Nevada desert that he once ruled, Las Vegas went on shining. The lights still glowing, the dice still rolling, the city still feeding on illusion. But somewhere beneath that glittering surface, the ghost of Tony Spilotro lingered, a reminder that in the world of organized crime, power is temporary, and death is permanent.